Awesome. I think we are live now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar for talking about automotive and simplifying kind of open source software compliance. I'm joined by two amazing folks, Brad Goldring and Russ Ealing. Today, we're going to cover a few topics, collaborating with stakeholders, policy creation, and compliance efficiency, as well as kind of a few highlights on the Biden executive order and how those might impact the automotive industry and beyond. So while we get started, I'm just going to share a few slides on topic. Just waiting for it to load really quick. So for us today, this is our headline. We're trying to help everyone simplify open source software compliance in the automotive industry. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post that as we're speaking and enjoy this panel. I just want to do a quick round of introductions. So right now I'm going to pass it over to Russ and Brad. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Carlos and the FOSSA team for having me. I'm the founder of OSS Engineering Consultants. We are a business that's dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes design, implement, and manage their open source governance programs. Before starting my company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. In my last role at GM, I developed and implemented a successful open source program office and built the team responsible for reviewing software for use of open source in every GM vehicle across the globe.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you again for having me, Dave, Carlos, and the FOSSA team. And thanks, everyone, for joining today. My name is Brad Goldring. Previous to my current role at GTC Law Group, I was a managing attorney at Ford Motor Company. There, I led the open source compliance program inside the Office of the General Counsel, and that handled all the inbound and outbound open source software used within the enterprise. And now, currently, a law group, I apply that experience to help advise our clients around open source usage, and I also support merger and acquisition transactions.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to transition here really quickly and just start out with a few warm-up questions. Really thankful once again to have Brad and Russ on here. Both of them with their General Motor experience and Ford experience is going to be very helpful in highlighting a few changes in the automotive industry and kind of thinking about best practices for open source. Just warming up with our first question, love to kind of dive in. Automotive industry, it's taking quite a rapid explosion, especially with the recent things that are happening. We're seeing a lot of EV push across the entire sector. How has the automotive industry changed in the last 10 years? I understand like open source wasn't really a thing in the space, and it hasn't really come about, but I'd love for you guys to dive in a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So, open source wasn't much of a consideration 10 years ago. At least from like a compliance perspective. So the use of open source existed in pockets, but like nothing like we see today. Despite the minimal use, I believe compliance, at least for the most part, wasn't given a whole lot of thought. You saw more adoption of open source in automotive over the last probably 5 years. And then it started showing up more in infotainment and connectivity spaces. And then active safety and autonomous driving applications were all using open source. And then you started seeing it in small devices in the vehicle that you wouldn't traditionally expect to see open source in, like power conversion units in electric vehicles, and even wireless phone chargers that can sometimes be embedded in your interior. But it was about that time, like 5 years ago or so, that we saw an increase in awareness of compliance across the industry. You saw requirements for open source bills of materials in contracts between suppliers, and then also between suppliers and the OEM. Some companies, like the one I used to work at, even had entire staffs to manage the in-vehicle compliance effort. And everyone's at a different state of maturity with this, but I'd say at least now it's pretty common to see at least one person responsible for open source at both OEMs and suppliers. And there's several OEMs and suppliers that have entire staffs to manage that as well. Brad, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely all of that. The evolution of open source usage in my previous role that I witnessed was pretty substantial during my time there, which is about 10 years. And from the beginning, starting out as a very conservative to sometimes an outright refusal to use any open source in certain areas, to open source really becoming an integral component of any development project, even up to and including in-vehicle use and for many of the different complex systems contained in a vehicle. Um, and I really feel the automotive space is like the ultimate platform to evaluate every possible use case for open source. You really see everything in that environment, from testing, internal use, and then websites and hosting. And now every major automotive manufacturer has a mobile application or two. And then all the way to infotainment systems and even safety critical systems now, and a lot of development with autonomous vehicles. And definitely throughout that time, as a result of that more widespread and mission critical and safety related usage, correspondingly, the level of review has really had to increase. So legal groups really have to have either a dedicated person or a team, like Russ alluded to, and of course, depending on the scale of your organization. And all that's necessary in order to support those reviews that need to take place. And then a little bit from the legal perspective is contracts should and now often include standardized language to address the inclusion of any third-party software, open source, or anything similar to that, and really be clear to outline the obligations for the software supplier that's delivering that solution in detail.
Thanks, Brad. And yeah, I mean, like you said, things have changed quite a lot 10 years ago when everyone's doing mostly proprietary code. So it's really refreshing to hear at least there's some interest in open source now. So I guess, kind of ducktailing into that, we're seeing open source in every company. It's in every single, I think, electric vehicle company that's being created. It's pretty popular. I mean, IBM, a traditional, very much patent-driven, proprietary code-driven company, buying Red Hat. Microsoft being the traditional proprietary company chasing after folks and buying GitHub. How has open source usage been unique in the auto industry? Really curious to hear both your takes on that.
I think the most obvious aspect is the complexity of the multi-layered supply chain. So one OEM can do business with like 18, 20,000 suppliers. Those suppliers then do business with other suppliers and other OEMs. Then there's the internal software development effort. So most OEMs contribute their own software that then goes on a device that came from a tier 1 supplier. So on top of managing all the open source coming in from the supply chain, you also have to manage the use of open source from your own internal development teams. And in most cases, those teams are distributed across the globe depending on the specific functions they support. So it gets really complex.
Yeah, I would say generally automotive companies historically really take a pretty conservative position when it comes to any risk around safety systems or software licensing, and also definitely protecting intellectual property related to software. And that can definitely be a concern with certain open source licenses. But like something hypothetically, imagine something like a stop sale injunction due to some alleged in some type of control system or infotainment in an F-150 truck. That's something that would amount to hundreds of millions of dollars of losses very quickly. And in the automotive world, being able to sell your product is just absolutely something that's not worth assuming any unnecessary risk over. So that conservative approach really makes sense.
Awesome. And I guess Brad, as you talked about, safety, I think, with risk and safety, what are some of the issues and challenges specific to the auto industry and open source? And Russ, you kind of mentioned OEMing and third-party supply chain. I think I don't think we really see that in a lot of other industries where you're working in enterprise software or even software in general. What are the risks and challenges? Love for you guys to highlight some of that.
Sure. I mean, something that I think a lot of people don't consider is the actual compliance aspect. So displaying license text and copyright notices on an instrument cluster or an infotainment screen may not be that difficult. But then what happens when you have a device like, let's say, your body control module? It doesn't have a screen to display anything on, right? So maybe you put that in the owner's manual, which is fine, but then what about the other 40-something ECUs or modules in the vehicle that might need to do the same thing? So with the amount of software in today's vehicles, if it were printed out, the license compliance section might almost look like its own textbook, right? So we obviously can't get too deep into this today, but the good news is it can be managed with the right approach and the right tools and processes in place.
Yeah, I've definitely seen notice and attribution files that look like textbooks. And then even going further from that is as we start to deal with new vehicles that are now supporting over-the-air updates, how do you maintain license compliance and notice compliance for any of those updates? Did we add open source components? Did we update some versions that might have new or different licenses and copyright notices? Or maybe teams were removing some open source components that were no longer required. Some other risks to maybe look out for here is related to international use or export concerns. A lot of popular encryption and security related algorithms are open source, and there can be concerns there with export in different countries. Also, potentially certain functionality, which might be based in some of your open source components, might not comply with safety standards in other countries. Or they might not be acceptable to some of your customers if you're in that software supplier role. So really got to be sure to determine what, if any, third-party software is acceptable to your customer or whatever the target country you may be intending to sell a product in.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I think especially over-the-air update, previously when you shipped a car, you would have to recall if there's any problems. But with software, you can make constant update, and in that you probably have to dynamically or constantly update the compliance or license or bill of materials, which I think we'll get into in a second here. But just transitioning really quickly, getting into actually what people are here to attend for is getting advice from you guys from best practices. But license compliance is pretty tedious. So, how do we think about making that a lot more efficient, automating it, ideally getting this to, I think, vehicles and whatnot is all about automation and supply and making that assembly line work really efficiently. How do we think about this for license compliance?
Yeah, tedious is absolutely a great way to summarize it. And as Russ just referenced, you can end up with notice attribution and any compliance documents that look like their own independent textbooks. They're just massive to support a lot of the code bases that are out there. So really, as the scale of that consumption of open source increases in any enterprise of any size, it's not really optional to not have some form of automation like you just mentioned. We need some type of automated tooling. So specifically, tooling that's going to enable you to deploy approval and review policies inside of new projects and build pipelines to really make that even more efficient. And having gone through many different iterations of implementing tooling, it became pretty clear over time that it was most critical to ensure that this capability was something that could really effortlessly be implemented by a development team. And kind of the way I always looked at it was my goal as legal counsel was, and legal counsel that, sometimes receive pushback from additional process or review steps that a development team might not be a big fan of, was really to always make sure you're presenting a solution to that development team that's just so easy and straightforward for them to implement or integrate into their build process. It would really just be silly for them not to integrate that, given the value to everyone involved. And from that, it can be helpful to both the development team and your legal group to ensure that first line of defense and that process or that review step it exists as early as possible in that development cycle. So if you can help a team flag a high-risk component for any license or maybe even security-related issues, as soon as they pull it into their project in the development stages, it's going to be a lot easier for that team to see the value of this additional process step. And instead of having to tell them to remediate some critical portion of their software or open source components a week before they're planning to launch a new solution. This way they'd be aware of that much earlier in the development cycle, and the value there is immense, especially to the development teams that could save a lot of time that way.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is it's not just about what automotive companies have to do, but we're seeing there's this regulatory piece as well across industry. I think United States wise, Biden just issued the executive order, which we think there might be some ramifications for auto industry. I don't know, Russ, can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look at like some of the more recent cyber attacks, I think it's easy to conclude that the software supply chain itself is under attack. So what the recent the Cybersecurity Executive Order sets out to do is to both modernize and implement stronger cyber standards in the federal government with the additional goal of improving security of the overall software supply chain. So the order still has elements that need to be defined. They have several milestones established over the next year for when those have to be provided. They're consulting with industry in order to get all their best practices in line. The order applies to US federal departments and their technology partners and suppliers. They also encourage the broader commercial technology industry to adopt the same strategy and practices. So going back to your question, what are the ramifications for automotive? It depends on how you or your supply chain may be providing software to a federal department. A direct impact could certainly be an automotive OEM that provides vehicles or other technology to the federal government. Other possibilities could be a lot more indirect, like perhaps a downstream supplier that's providing software to both automotive OEMs and the federal government.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. And I think we're really seeing this, being a really big push from the U.S. Department of Commerce. And at least for myself, we're starting to see some pickup in some of the countries that we're aligned with, which, in the UK, as well as in Australia, they seem to be taking similar positions. So really interesting to see how the rest of the world ends up adopting a similar rule. Kind of switching to that, I think in order to actually comply, when I think of it is when you buy like some sort of hardware, you get this full manual spec of what you're actually getting. And I think we'll eventually get similar take on that. And that's what we really call, I think, the software bill of materials. But I think earlier in our discussions with Russ and Brad, there's actually two different types. And love for you guys to go over that. I think there was the open source software bill of materials, which is slightly different than what the Biden executive order is asking for, software bill of materials. Love for you guys to talk about creation of that, differences between the two as well.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, maybe I'll just start with the SBOM. So SBOM itself is a software bill of materials. And in the context of the executive order, an SBOM is a formal machine-readable inventory of your software components and their dependencies. So it can include software beyond just open source, but the bulk of a typical SBOM will generally still be open source. In fact, if you look at the minimum elements for an SBOM that was recently published by Department of Commerce and the NTIA, you'll see that component name, version, and dependency relationship are the central elements. So these minimum elements are really very similar to what you might already be tracking for your use of open source in your company. Other types of software you might find on an SBOM could include non-open source third-party software, as well as commercial software and others. So the scope of SBOM is broader than OSS BOM, but put another way, an OSS BOM could be thought of as a subset of what you might find on an SBOM. Brad, do you want to talk a little bit about OSS BOM?
Yeah, for sure. So with respect to the open source bill of material, or OSS BOM, there's really varying approaches, and Russ kind of just referenced some of kind of the minimum standards, but there's different approaches to the depth of dependencies that you could choose to include, and also the level of detail about each component. And also something I actually just mentioned about that executive order is we can also talk about the hierarchy of components and their associated dependencies that should be laid out, so you can really see where different dependencies are getting pulled in from. But for determining what's appropriate for your solution, some questions that might be valuable to ask would be things like, what's the risk tolerance of your organization or the organization you're selling to? And what level of dependencies from that are you comfortable reviewing to, 3 or 4 levels down, or do you need to get that complete tree? And then maybe contractually, what does your client require to provide as a deliverable when it comes to that bill of materials, either open source or all software and third-party works? And then from all that, it can be important to work to contractually define the format and level of inclusion for those components and their dependence in that contracting stage to ensure that the responsibility of that software supplier that might be doing some development work for you is able to provide this data prior to delivery of the software or alongside the delivery of the software. I've even seen some scenarios where it can be a contractual requirement for the customer to actually have pre-approval of either certain licenses or even certain components during those development stages in some type of work for hire or development relationship. It can also be an option during the contracting or statement of work phase on a per project basis to request that that software developer or provider is going to be able to provide to you a usable notice and attribution file, something that they can provide you the necessary protections as well, that file is complete and accurate for you to either start building your notice and attribution file from or potentially rely on if you have a high level of trust with that supplier.
Yeah, and I think, seeing in the industry itself, at least for myself, Google Cloud Platform, they require people to submit open source bill of materials when they're trying to publish on GCP. How do we actually create one? Like tactically, Brad, like what does it entail? What are things that we should actually think about? Whether it's package names or other things, like how do we build one? What does it entail? Can you walk through that a bit more?
Well, yeah, this can be a pretty daunting project, and really just automated tooling is just critical here. Given the scale of a lot of software projects and the scale of their open source dependencies, it's just necessary to have something to help you at least take that first turn. And you could have different minimum elements. So GCP might have a certain requirement of the minimum elements required to describe each component. It's really important to understand what either your customer or wherever you're releasing a project needs to meet those requirements. And that could also be something defined in contractual terms as well, but there really aren't any universally defined standards for that. So we work with whoever you're selling to or whoever you're buying from to work together to define what you need to meet your requirements. And then if you're using some automated tooling as well, based on your risk tolerance inside your organization or the level of trust in your tooling, some type of manual human validation might be required, but definitely at the very least, I'm going to recommend a moderate spot check of the output for validation. But again, it depends on the tooling and what your risk tolerance is for that and the complexity of those projects.
Russ, I don't know if you can add to that.
Yeah, I mean, just maybe from the SBOM perspective, and it kind of ties into OSS BOM as well, but I mean, you need to start with an inventory of your open source software. So assuming you have that, or at least a means to get to that state, the next step is to generate the SBOM. There's a section in the recently published SBOM minimum elements that talks about automation support that could include automatic generation and machine readability of SBOMs, which then allows you to scale across the software ecosystem. The current formats used for generating those are a little different. For generating and consuming SBOMs, it's SPDX, CycloneDX, and software ID tags or SWID tags. There's plenty of options available for tools to generate and consume SBOMs in these formats. But again, you need something to put into the SBOM format. So that means you need to know what software you're using.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, so I guess kind of talking more about SBOM for a second, and I think understanding some of the not only open source but third party, like we saw with SolarWinds, that was like a big. I think the reason for the Biden executive order was that was a big cyber attack. So I don't know, Russ, if you can highlight a bit more of the role of SBOM and open source help with cybersecurity. At least from my sake, I've seen things with like CodeCov and the open source side being a supply chain attack for a lot of companies that have open source projects as well. Love for you to kind of expand on that.
Yeah, kind of in the last point there, I always talk about the importance of inventory of your open source usage. So inventory is critical regardless of your focus, whether it's open source compliance or the security of open source software. So you can neither comply, secure, nor remediate any software you don't know is there. Or, as President Biden said in a national security memorandum that came out just yesterday, we cannot address the threats we cannot see. So for companies with an open source program office, or OSPO for short, they likely already have this inventory. I think there's tremendous value for the organization when the OSPO can share a list of known open source with the security folks, and then the security folks can then run their threat analysis against that robust inventory. Given the automotive focus of the session, though, I feel like I have to make this association of open source inventory and the inventory and tracking practices that I think Brad mentioned it earlier as well. So like every car built has a listing of every part required to build that car. So this helps the automaker to quickly track and then address any quality issues. So if and when a part happens to be faulty, they can quickly determine which cars were affected and then prioritize any subsequent actions that might be needed, such as recalls or service bulletins or whatever it is. The same should be true for software. So similar to automotive parts, with an inventory, an organization can then track every open source component they use and have better ability to resolve those issues when they arise. In the case of security, knowing the exact version of each component used is critical. And then the accuracy of your open source bill of materials or your SBOM allows you to assess risks quickly and potentially reduce or eliminate any potential rework. I spoke a lot about inventory already, but I mean, feel free if anyone has any questions afterwards, they can reach out or post your question in the chat.
Yeah, and just to reinforce all your points quickly, Russ, knowledge is just absolutely the key to success here. There's just no way you can quickly address any security or license-related remediation without having a complete and accurate listing of all the components, and like you said, versioning throughout all of your software. And that might be a little bit off topic, but it's also relevant if you're a smaller company that might be thinking about a potential future acquisition. One of the first things you're going to be asked during due diligence is, hey, give me a listing of all of your open source or third-party software and versions, and basically as much information as possible as you can provide. And if you're able to provide a really accurate and complete listing quickly and upfront during any due diligence, that's just going to reflect incredibly well on your organization.
Yeah, that's really true, Brad. And I think part of it too is, thinking about supply chain risks, whether you're acquiring a company that's kind of adding into your supply chain, or even OEM or third party. Like, on a legal perspective, how do we think about supply chain risks? Because you're inheriting all this third party, I guess, OSS bomb or software bill of materials from other companies as well. Do you mind talking a bit about that?
Yeah, no, definitely critical stuff. And really, it really makes me refer back to just that previous comment regarding the importance of having that really comprehensive and accurate knowledge of your software's composition and any software that you've pulled in from some third party into your solution. And it's critical in every step of that supply chain to have that thorough understanding of the makeup of any third-party software in their deliverables. Now, of course, I'm going to tackle this from a legal perspective and how that can be addressed. It really depends on where you are in that supply chain. So let's say hypothetically, you're a tier 1 supplier, so you're kind of in the middle. What does your master service agreement look like with the OEM that you're selling to? If you are working with a work-for-hire developer that you're hiring, are they going to have the requisite capital to be able to litigate or pay out any potential lawsuits that might get passed through from an OEM, maybe related to some improperly licensed third-party software or another type of infringement claim? And then should you, as that tier 1, maybe to supplement that, retain necessary insurance to cover that gap? And then what do you do to pass on the cost of that insurance? Is that a cost of doing business for you? Is that a cost that you pass on to that developer that you're hiring? There's a lot of unique ways to kind of tackle that problem. But
yeah, I think that's like even in M&A, we see reps and warranties being a major thing, and IP and open source being a component of that. So I think insurance is a very interesting topic around open source. And that's
yeah, it can get really difficult in this space because of just the staggering scale and sometimes the staggering difference in scale of different parties involved in this development. You're looking at an OEM that could be a Fortune 10 company to some small software development firm that's supplying a tier 1, or maybe they own some IP that's unique in the autonomous vehicle space that they and only they have. And passing that burden of liability and reps and warranties through that supply chain can be really challenging to manage safely.
Yeah. If anyone has questions about that, Brad's the perfect person to ask on the legal side. But in terms of just jumping into more best practices, right? So building this is really hard. I think it's very much a cross-functional effort. And so can both you guys talk about best practices in building an open source program, running it cross-functionally, like setting examples of, like, I think corporate policies, like how do you work through this?
Yeah, this is definitely something I'm sure Russ and I could talk about for several hours of more webinars. It's not a simple task, especially as your organizations get very large and complex. But I would probably say, because of the size and complexity, typically it's going to be really important to define clear roles and responsibilities to really develop an effective open source program inside your enterprise. And then if we go right to the beginning of maybe the process of implementing something like tooling, during that tooling selection process, really you got to make sure and ensure that all the key stakeholders have a role in evaluating and selecting what the best tools are going to be for your environments and your requirements from a legal or security perspective. And it's really critical that everyone's voice be heard during that process. So you ensure you're selecting something that's going to meet your needs. And then once you've selected that tool, define when and where in the build or development process that scanning is going to occur. And you can go back to what I was talking about earlier. Absolutely try to do your best to get that as early in that development process as possible. It's invaluable to know that you've flagged something that might have a security or license risk before developers even done their first build or done any type of QA build. It's so valuable to know that early on. And then your legal teams are going to need to define policies based on license and use case, as will the security teams based on their risk tolerance and maybe to help flag items for a more manual or thorough review. And then also, this can be helpful for developers. It can be helpful to define SLAs for the reviewing team, so your legal and your security teams, as part of your process workflow. And that can just be helpful for your development teams to have an expectation on timing for the feedback that they're going to get from those teams for those higher risk items that you might flag for maybe, say, a manual review. And then once you really start operationalizing all these different elements, you're hopefully going to move towards having a pretty well-oiled machine.
Yeah.
And I think from a cross-functional perspective, I think you often see variation in levels of compliance between engineering or development teams or business units, whether they support different products or perhaps different functions on the same product. But regarding best practices, at least with my clients, I really focus on consistency across the product development organization, a common process and simplification of where to go when you have questions. As Brad mentioned earlier, discovering open source early in the development cycle is another best practice. So your process should really address this. And Brad also talked about provisions and contracts for use of open source. So this is important because you need to know what software is coming in so you understand what you may also be redistributing with your product.
Awesome. And I guess, I think this is a really hard piece, but, I think I mentioned this, creating like a policy or even a corporate policy, whether you're thinking about adoption, using open source, creating open source, it's really hard. And especially in automotive, I think people are just like, no, you can't open source anything. You can't contribute upstream. It's creating that policy and getting everyone to actually be happy with it, and engineers not quitting, I think is a tough thing. So, how do you guys think about policy creation? Whether it's from the OSPO or whether it's from the legal side, and how do you make sure everyone's happy?
Yeah, it's definitely the hardest part of any policy creation, especially in a large enterprise where development teams are already probably bogged down by a good chunk of red tape and policies and approvals. It's really challenging. And so one of my kind of favorite pieces of advice here is to involve what I kind of refer to as like the vocal developer, and involving them as early on in any policy creation process as you can. So that's typically like a development team member that's like a thought leader. It has that thought leader role inside the organization. They might be a little bit more outspoken than some of the other developers, or they might be, let's say, the leader of some of software guilds inside your organization for certain technologies. And involving them is going to be so valuable to overcome some of those challenges that you alluded to. They're going to have visibility into some of the issues and challenges that might not be immediately obvious to the legal team or the security teams. And then once you work with those development stakeholders inside your organization and you all work together as a team to develop an open source security or license policy, they're also really going to become invaluable to you as a legal group when potentially there might be some pushback, like you referred to, when implementing one of these new policies or procedures. And what they can do, because they've now have a vested interest in helping develop that, and they're really going to have a good understanding of the value of that, they can help act as advocates for that new policy to help the larger developer teams understand the value it provides and the value it provides to the organization because they've had that integral role of developing it with you. And again, you can always use that example of helping to identify any issues, license or security related, really, really early on in the process. And if you can tell a developer, hey, we're going to be able to help you flag license compliance issues as soon as you've done your first build, just doing some preliminary development, as opposed to that 1 week before you're going to launch a solution, I think they'll understand that value pretty quickly.
Awesome. Yeah, so I guess, just last piece, and maybe we can turn over to questions really quickly here. But Russ, if you were to give one main advice to anyone, like that's core, and maybe they can contact you after this, is, how can they make this really fast and efficient? I think part of any motor company that we see is automation is everything, or we're seeing that across the board. But how do you make this super automated? How do you make sure this is super efficient and fast? What's your one piece of advice if you were to give to the audience?
Yeah, so I'll probably hit on a couple points here. Obviously, tooling is an important element, but it's just that, it's one element. If you're a company that, you're an OEM or part of the supply chain, perhaps you're just starting out on this journey, or you've got some other resource constraints, Excel is perfectly acceptable starting point, but it's just no longer scalable long-term. Software and open source bill of materials specifically have just gotten so big with the amount of open source available and with the just dramatic increase in the use of package managers. You need tooling in order to manage this. Beyond tooling, you need people to manage the tool and the compliance flow and the coordination of that. This can be done as part of a governance program like an OSPO, which is what I usually end up setting up for most of my clients. Other aspects we already discussed are common processes, consistent policies, as Brad mentioned. Strategy is another big item that companies don't always think about. So you want to empower your organization to balance the business benefits of using open source with the right amount of risk management. Another way I like to frame this up for my clients when we're starting out on a project is to set this up so that we make it easy for a developer to do the right thing. So strategy, process, policy, these are all really foundational elements for this to be effective.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything you just said, Russ. And then tooling is key. Given the scale of the challenges when it comes to the complexity of software and the open source components that support that software, it's a necessary first step. And even just the aspect of it eliminating human error as well in doing auditing of what might be in a package manager or something like that. I've certainly seen a lot of instances in the past where tooling caught things that humans had missed. But also slightly, I'm going to take this from a little bit of a legal perspective, being sure to define contractually up front, maybe before you even begin any development engagement, laying out, like we've talked about several times, what your minimum requirements are. What do you need to know? Do you need an OSS bomb? And then in that, what does it need to contain? How many levels of dependencies? I've always seen a lot of problems get run into when that wasn't addressed early on in a contract or a statement of work. And you now have a supplier delivering a piece of software for you, and you go tell the legal team, and they go, okay, well, what is the software made up of? And they go, I don't know. And then you go to that supplier, and that supplier hasn't prepared any of these materials. They don't know what the minimum requirements are for you, or they just say, maybe I'm not going to do that because it's not part of our contractual agreement. So really be sure to lay out those expectations in writing early on in any new software development relationship. And that's going to make that compliance process a lot faster and a lot more efficient if you know that you're getting exactly what you need to do your compliance and reviews from any software suppliers or work for hire engagements that you're involved in.
Awesome. So I just want to turn it over to questions, but right before we turn it over to questions, I do want to share ways for you to contact Brad or Russ. So just a quick slide here. If you want to contact Russ or Brad after this, feel free. They're happy to help answer any questions, and they are available to assist. So that's Russ at ossengineeringconsultants.com and bgoldring@gptlawgroup.com.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Carlos.
Yeah. And I guess turning over to the questions and and whatnot, I think one of the questions that I had that I can answer really quickly, how would FOSSA help facilitate with compliance in the automotive or even in manufacturing industries? At least for us, we're able to actually help automate this process for you to understand all the open source that you're using, help streamline your build materials, kind of like what Brad and Russ said. And those are things that you can check out our website to get more answers. So I'm not going to go too deep on this. But I think the other questions that we have are a little bit more interesting. I think for Russ, at a 10,000 plus person company, how do you get all of the teams to effectively adopt? Rolling out policies and strict enforcement / accountability seems hard.
It's not hard. It definitely takes time, and it's an organizational change management effort. So it's part technical, it's part involving your legal department, and then it's engaging the leadership from the top of the company in order to drive this through. I mean, sometimes we call this the culture of compliance, where you have to get the leadership to adopt this mentality, and then it's like a top-down forcing function, and they get all the other teams to buy in. I find at most companies, certainly, all ranges of smaller companies all the way through, tens of thousands of developers, the developers are generally more willing to let go of this thing. That it's one less thing they have to worry about. If you can automate something and have a robust process around it, or have an individual or a team that's going to manage this for them, they're generally happy to let go of that. So I mean, it's generally quite effective, but certainly, yeah, the challenge is to in rolling this out across a large organization, and that's where the kind of the people side comes in this organizational change management activity.
Yeah, and Russ, to keep going with that, that's definitely excellent from like the high level. And then what I would typically try to use from the developer perspective, because typically, or sometimes just chasing them with the stick doesn't work. And so that's when we'll get into that's where I touched on several times, was helping them see the value of this, and how it can help protect their development and help make what they're doing more efficient. And save them time up front. Hey, if you involve this automated scanning process early in your development cycle, you're going to receive a lot of value from that in quickly identifying any security or license related issues. And I found a lot of teams early on maybe weren't doing security reviews, and it was helping them identify vulnerabilities really quickly and saying, hey, I shouldn't use this. I should use a later version or a completely different solution for the problem I'm trying to solve.
Yeah, I think for myself, similarly, seeing the carrot and the stick, I would say. On the carrot side, I think, Russ, you mentioned this earlier. It's like, how do you enable people to contribute upstream or contribute open source? I think that's like really much a carrot for a lot of engineers, because they kind of want to give back to the community. And then I think the stick part is just, hey, like, this is going to help keep things secure and keep us risk free. So I think there's a kind of balanced approach there. I think one other interesting thing that we just got was what specific approaches for license compliance are you actually seeing, or do you recommend for automotive providers? So whether you're an OEM or I think even like tier 2 or tier 3, I think the second part to that question, are you seeing the notice like textbooks, as one of you guys referenced earlier, being physically provided, or just like a URL to third-party notices in like driver manuals and stuff like that? And distributing this is pretty hard. Yeah, can you guys speak about that?
Yeah, I can go for a second. Definitely, I don't think anyone's shipping, maybe they are. I have not in the previous role shipped a textbook with a vehicle. And it goes back to what we talked about too with over-the-air updates. How do you update that notice and compliance textbook if we're going to be start doing updates to that vehicle? Or even the diversity in vehicles. One vehicle may have certain systems and another may not have other systems. So I definitely think the URL inside an infotainment system or inside an owner's manual, probably preferably both, to then provide that customer the ability to access all of any maybe source code that might be required to be shipped alongside the vehicle, or any notice and attribution files that are required. So, and with over-the-air updates, something like that is really a requirement. And again, it would probably be pretty onerous as well to display all your notice and attributions in a infotainment interface as well. That would be pretty cumbersome with the scale of some of them.
And I think just to add on to that a little bit, I think that an additional challenge along with that is, earlier I mentioned the complexity of the multi-layered supply chain. And when you've got all of these various suppliers that are providing software into the vehicle, how do you get this coordinated effort into this single display? It's not impossible. It's not without challenges. And I think it's up to each company's risk tolerance as well. Do they want a URL out there that's pointing somewhere? Do they want it at their own site or at a supplier's site or whatever it is? I mean, there's a lot of risk management that has to go into this, or risk tolerance, I think, that's unique to every company.
Awesome. Any point of view on SBOM formats? I mean, this is a good question. SBOM formats, SPDX, Cyclone DX. I think what Brad mentioned earlier, everyone has their own requirements, whether you're a Google Cloud platform or you're now the government. It doesn't seem like we really have like a strong, like, this is how you're supposed to do it. Russ and Brad, what do you guys think? Like, should we have like a really formalized, like, this is how you should do it across the industry, or should it still be loosey-goosey the way we're seeing it? Or, yeah.
So, I mean, from an open source bill of materials perspective, it's, you know, I think there's minimum elements that almost everybody agrees on. And then there's additional elements that become preferences. So you've got your component, the version of that component, and the license for that component, and potentially where you got that component from. From an SBOM perspective, when you talked about some of the different formatting, that comes down to preferences and requirements. So nobody out there right now is saying you must present this in SPDX format, or you must, or no one that I'm aware of is saying that you have to, you know, provide this in the Cyclone DX format or the SWID format. And there's tools that can kind of go between all three versions, but to get there, you still need, going back to inventory, you still have to start with that baseline inventory that you can run into those SBOM generation tools.
Brad, any opinions on that of standardization? I mean, sure.
No, it really comes down to maybe your organization has a preference to managing internally in an SPDX format, and then contractually you're going to require your software suppliers to provide their OSS bombs to you in that format. I don't want to declare a winner or a preferred approach to that, but it really comes down to your organization's preference and what your minimum requirements are that Russ talked about.
I mean, it might make your M&A process a little easier.
It could, but every large organization handles acquisitions a little bit differently, and whoever is buying you might need to defer to what their preference is. So you might need to be prepared to provide in any format, and maybe it's an Excel file, like Russ mentioned.
But having your inventory at least gives you the flexibility to generate that in whatever format's required. It's a much more difficult exercise to go just scramble and say, oh my gosh, okay, tell me what we're using in all of our products right now. And if you don't have that, that's
and you have 48 hours.
Yeah, it's impossible in most cases.
I guess, how do we think, so this is more broader questions, but how do you think open source will impact auto industry in the future? I mean, you know, we saw this, we see a wide, at least from my perspective, we see a wide adoption with Android operating system. There's we've seen this in mobile, where we've seen mobile battle between Android operating system and iOS, and then we've seen other people try to tackle that to become market leaders, but Android and iOS are winning as the operating system for for mobile. But I guess in vehicle, I feel like it's a new platform. People aren't really thinking about it as much, and there might be some open source winners in the in-vehicle space or in the automotive space, but love to get Russ and Brad your take. That's my take on how open source will impact, but yeah.
I mean, I think there's just going to be more prolific use of open source in the vehicle. There already is. Like, I mean, the increase has been just incredible. Again, going back to 5-6 years ago when you started seeing like a Linux OS in a box that was going into a vehicle, and all of a sudden you had to worry about compliance or be concerned about compliance. So I think from an operating system perspective, there's plenty of choices out there. I mean, Android is one of them. There's QNX. There's others out there. I think that comes down to the OEM and the supplier's preference in that area. But you're going to be pretty hard pressed to find one of those operating systems that don't, even if it's a commercial operating system, it most likely has open source in it. I would wager a large bet on that.
Yeah, so I think, Carlos, what you're kind of getting at is just standardization is going to be one thing that's going to be interesting. So you could have a lot more development opportunities for third-party companies to develop apps to be installed in a vehicle's infotainment system if the majority of vehicles are running, say, Android Auto or something to that effect. But kind of from an open source perspective, one of the ones that's really exciting for me is the potential for collaboration. We're even seeing that in some autonomous vehicle development as companies are deciding to open source their platforms, maybe some of their patents or other intellectual property, allowing for a lot of really valuable collaboration and the reuse of work, which is really the core of open source and really the value we get from that. People being able to, with immense resources, come together and work on projects and new solutions to problems. That I think that's really the spirit and the excitement that comes from open sourcing technologies generally.
Yeah, very cool. So I think we're almost at time here. We answered a few questions. If there's any additional questions, we'll take it right now. Besides that, we'll give that like maybe a little bit. But besides that, I don't know if you guys have any final parting advice. Maybe you guys can talk a bit more about how you guys might be able to help. If like why should people contact you after this as well?
The shameless plug section.
Go ahead,
no, I think we talked a lot about some of the different things that we both have experience in, but definitely if you are a smaller organization looking to be acquired, we support smaller, medium-sized companies all the time in being acquired. We have a lot of expertise with respect to open source and helping you put together these bill of materials and things like that. And we also support a lot of very large organizations who are out there acquiring smaller software companies and things like that. So we have an extensive expertise in supporting both sides of mergers and acquisitions and preparing companies to be more viable to be acquired. And I think we talked about a lot of different ways that you can help prepare yourself for that earlier. Yeah, Russ?
Yeah, so our company kind of helps more on the open source program office or open source governance program, whatever you want to call it. We take that experience largely from automotive in managing that multi-layered complex supply chain. And we can apply that to almost any industry, which we have actually from all sizes, from very small startup companies all the way through large global enterprises. We can apply that experience accordingly at whatever level you guys need, whether that's guidance or full hands-on implementation.
Awesome. And FOSSA weather tooling. So if you guys are interested in help, need any help with that for tooling, whether you're an engineer, a security individual, or legal or OSPO person, we're here to help. So yeah. Well, I think that's the wrap of it for this time, unless there's any other questions. Once again, thank you so much, Russ. Thank you so much, Brad. You're both really amazing. Please contact them or even link them if you need any help with anything, or just stay in touch. You never know if you guys might cross roads. And I think the open source space is all about giving back. So thank you so much for giving back your time in helping with this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Likewise, same. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys. I'm gonna be ending the talk, and everyone have a great day.